Okay, here we go, talking about race, ethnicity, and stratification. Canada is a multicultural country, proudly so. In fact, we make it a point to promote how multicultural we are compared to some other countries. Let's be honest, sometimes in kind of an arrogant manner. Our government has repeatedly and loudly talked about the benefits of immigration, and in the 70s and 80s, the Canadian government even made it official. In 1971, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau announced in the House of Commons that bilingualism and multiculturalism would be official policies to be implemented in Canada. The Prime Minister said, and this is a direct quote, "Uniformity is neither desirable nor possible in a country the size of Canada. We should not even be able to agree upon the kind of Canadian to choose a model, let alone persuade most people to emulate it. There are few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians that they must be alike. There is no such thing as a model or ideal Canadian. What could be more absurd than the concept of an all-Canadian boy or girl? A society which emphasizes uniformity is one which creates intolerance and hate. A society which eulogizes the average citizen is one which breeds mediocrity. What the world should be seeking, and what in Canada we must continue to cherish, are not concepts of uniformity, but human values, compassion, love, and understanding." End quote. The Canadian Multiculturalism Act was introduced by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney in 1988, which included that federal funds began to be distributed to ethnic groups to help them preserve their cultures. So we take the importance of multiculturalism very seriously in Canada. How successful are we? That's up for debate. The US, although they are our immediate neighbor, has a very different track record than Canada, historically speaking and currently. And I am not for a moment suggesting that Canada has a great or even good track record, because the road to disaster is paved with the best intentions. Just look at the history of how Indigenous people have been treated in our country, and we all know that we have no right to stand on a soapbox. But the US does have a somewhat darker history than Canada due to slavery. And while it likes to promote itself as accepting all people, the Statue of Liberty was a gift from France in 1886, and on her base is a tablet inscribed with, "Give me your poor, your tired, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore." The fact is that race seems to be a much more contentious issue in the US. To understand the situation in both countries and elsewhere, first we need to make sure we're on the same page regarding some basic terms. And I'm going to use the exact definitions the text uses, although just remember you'll see slightly different other ones as well elsewhere. Ethnic groups are groups within a larger society that to some degree are set apart from others by displaying a unique set of cultural traits. This might include religion, language, customs, traditions, clothing, etc. Ethnic groups focus on the feelings of belonging for their members, a sense of association, a sense of community, a sense of being linked to each other, which again creates a sense of community, a sense of belonging. Now, how strongly somebody identifies with their ethnic group, but how strongly they perpetuate their ethnicity, will depend on each person as an individual, their family experiences and expectations, the wider community, and other factors. So it's not based just on how you were raised, just on how your family socialized you. And usually, even if a family is completely committed to their ethnic origins, once they immigrate to another country, each successive generation will become less and less committed in the same way. In other words, they will be gradually assimilated into wider society, even if it is something they don't want to occur. Even so, their ethnicity will remain a point of identification, a point of commonality. For example, somebody whose family historically comes from Ireland might not give it much thought until every year on St. Patrick's Day, and then they proudly boast about their heritage. If they are Irish Protestant, they might find themselves in a discussion talking about how negative and wrong Irish Catholics are, or vice versa. So even though that person's Irish heritage is distant, and they don't really have much to do with it, there's still a feeling of loyalty, a feeling of connectedness, and that can be quite intense. It's really not unusual at all for people from two different ethnicities, two different cultures that had a conflict in the past historically to have a discussion about it today and still butt heads. Not to actually fight about it, but to feel a need to maintain a sense of loyalty to their ethnic group. Ethnicity is a basis of being ranked. Even in Canada and the US, even if it might seem like a distant basis for classification, that doesn't matter much anymore because, well, my ancestors came here a couple hundred years ago. Ethnicity is still a point of classification. And I thought it was great that your text brought in the idea of pan-ethnic groups, meaning that several distinct ethnic groups are instead grouped together into one based on the region of the world they came from. Let's be honest, many of us tend to do that very often. So you don't say somebody is Brazilian or Chilean or Argentinian, you just say they're from South America. You don't say somebody is Chinese or Japanese or Korean, you just say they're Asian. And as Canadians, we get so offended when people try to lump us in with Americans like we're all the same. If you've ever been traveling out of the country and somebody asks if you're American, it's very common to quickly correct them like, no, I'm Canadian. Like, ew, don't tell me I'm an American. But then we tend to do it to other groups as well. We often do not feel it necessary to identify somebody as Iranian. We just say they're from the Middle East and it's like, oh, that's close enough. Now, race refers to people who share a similar genetic characteristic or gene frequency. And the concept of race, the idea of race, sounds like it would be really straightforward. Either or, black or white, no pun intended. But boy, is race anything but, and it's often used incorrectly. Not just by lay people, but by people who are quite educated. I want you to pay close attention to what the text says in this regard, regarding what race means and what it refers to. Yes, absolutely 100%. People can have similar physical characteristics or different physical characteristics. Height, weight, skin color, hair color, eye shape, the general shape of the face, everything. And yes, absolutely, over the course of history, as evolution has occurred, certain physical traits have occurred more often in certain areas. And because of that, we can say accurately that people from certain areas of the world are likely to possess certain physical traits. They're likely to have certain physical traits in common. But that doesn't mean that these physical traits that they have in common are completely based on heredity. Because every kind of human group there is has the possibility of breeding certain traits to be dominant. Basically inbreeding, not every group of humans, not just every race. And this is the part of race that is usually misunderstood. The idea of race is not a genetic one, it is a socially constructed idea. There have been many studies conducted about this and a few interesting documentaries on YouTube produced about the effects of inbreeding. When people who are genetically closely related continue to breed each new generation. And as a result, the same genetic traits are passed down over and over and over. And as indicated in the text, what does being of one race mean? It certainly doesn't mean that everybody who is classified as one race is the same, that they have the same genetic traits. What does it mean if you say somebody's African American, or what is once again becoming the more common term, Black? Um, and I'll use the term Black and African American interchangeably after reading in several areas that this is actually the term that's preferred. So this is why academics argue that race is a social creation, a social construction. If you look at the young woman on the bottom row, second from the right, her skin is quite dark compared to the young lady who is kitty quarter to her in the upper row, but they're all just considered Black. Wider society hears this term race, and they automatically think only of a genetic characteristic, such as dark skin when somebody is Black. But there are so many variations of darker skin. How do we determine if somebody's Black or not? Some people who are Caucasian tan so darkly in the summer, they look Latino. And some people have skin that just looks Latino all the time when they're technically white. Some people who are Black are very dark, while others almost appear like they're Latino with a dark tan, and others appear more Caucasian. So if somebody's identified as Black, that doesn't mean they look one specific exact way, that they have one specific exact set of genetic traits. So with that in mind, how is it possible to say that race is truly genetic? In the past, racial passing would sometimes occur, when a person who is a member of one racial group would pass in society as belonging to another. And it usually refers to somebody passing as Caucasian even though they are a member of a minority group. Why would somebody want to pass as white? Well, to avoid discrimination and prejudice. And in the US during slavery, if a slave was able to escape and they could pass as white, that meant they were free. Whatever racial classification a person is given might change depending on where they are when they're classified. Are they in the US? Are they in Cuba? Are they in a different country in Europe? Because some countries consider a certain tone of skin to mean being Black, while other countries would look at the exact same person and classify them differently. This is why when we talk about race, it's a system of classification that depends on self-identification as well as social identification that is imposed by wider society. If a person has one white parent and one Black parent, for example, what would they refer to themselves as? It's probably going to depend on the tone of their skin, and whatever conclusion they come to is based on how they identify themselves and how their society identifies them. In some countries, it would matter which parent was white and which parent was Black, with the father's ethnicity being the determining factor. So if, for argument's sake, they classify themselves as white, does that mean they're not Black at all? No. If, for argument's sake, they classify themselves as Black, does that mean they're not white at all? No. In Rwanda, during the genocide that occurred there in 1994, rape was specifically used as a weapon to eliminate the Tutsi ethnic minority, because in that country, a child's ethnicity was determined by their father's ethnicity. So when a Tutsi woman was raped and became pregnant and gave birth to a child, the child was viewed as by wider society as Hutu, as part of the dominant ethnic group. And the idea was, if that happened often enough, the Tutsis would just eventually be eliminated. So race is not the tidy, neat, simple little organizational tool that a lot of people like to think it is. The idea of race is just that. It's an idea. It's a socially constructed idea that's created and applied by the society in which people live. Okay, well then how do you determine what racial group you belong to? Well, in Canada, we have Statistics Canada as the main entity that collects this information. And currently, the options a person has for filling out the Canadian census focuses on the term visible minorities. According to the Canadian census, visible minorities are defined as persons other than Aboriginal peoples who are non-Caucasian in race or non-white in color. And in the Canadian census, the categories include South Asian, Chinese, Black, Filipino, Latin American, Southeast Asian, West Asian, Korean, Japanese, and visible minority NIE, meaning not included elsewhere. In the US, they only have 5 major categories, including white, Black, Hispanic, Asian or Pacific Islander, and American Indian or Alaskan Native. So for both the US and Canada, it seems pretty organized. Just check out a box on the form or fill in that little circle, and there you go. A nice, neat way to go about it. Well, actually, in Canada, these categories are being revamped because they don't allow for Canadians who identify as members of multiple visible minorities to indicate what those multiple minority groups they belong to are. So people who for years have been grouped into single categories regardless of their background. This is important since in the 2016 census, over 230,000 Canadians indicated membership to 2 or more visible minority groups. But the census didn't collect information on what those groups were. In the US, using overly simplistic terms like white and black are just that, overly simplistic. The term Hispanic is more ethnic in origin than racial in origin, similar to a pan-ethnic group that is not specific at all. And then there are American Indians, many of whom look as Caucasian as the most Caucasian-looking person you can imagine, and who come from hundreds of different tribes across the country. They are not all the same. So these categories that the governments of both countries like us to think are really useful and provide a lot of information are not as useful as they need to be. They are not as inclusive as they need to be, and are even less useful when you remember that these categories are based on social constructs, human-made categories. They are not naturally occurring. And because of that, they are subject to revision and change. As odd as it sounds, a government could literally decide to change the criteria they use to determine what race you belong to. And this isn't just some arbitrary decision either, such as in Canada when the government needs to determine if somebody is Indigenous or not. The first time this occurred was in 1850 when the Canadian government said an Indigenous person was any person of Indian blood, of Indian birth or blood, any person reputed to belong to a particular group of Indians, and any person married to an Indian or adopted into an Indian family. So a white person who's adopted by an Indian family, or if a white woman marries an Indigenous male, she would then be considered Native. In 1985, there was a revision to the Indian Act, and their criteria used to define who was and who was not considered a status Indian in Canada. And they expanded their criteria quite a bit. So at that point, Indian women who married a non-Indian could no longer lose their Indian status, whereas in the past, if she married a white man or somebody else, she was no longer considered Indian. In addition, her children would not, and anybody who could, or anybody who had in the past, could apply to be re-registered as a status Indian. This affected more than 114,000 people. So over 114,000 people ended up being classified as a status Indian in Canada as a result of this. So was this a positive change? Yeah, but think about it for a minute. A government of a country decides one day to change what the identifying features are of a racial category, which totally blows the idea that race is genetic out of the water. Yet, the majority of people still view it that way. Looking at your text, it refers to what it calls the American ethnic composition. And this is going to become more and more of an issue as the population of the US becomes less and less distinct from each other. as the population becomes more and more homogeneous or more similar to each other. And there's no reason to believe that the situation will be any different in Canada. In our country as well, different ethnicities and races and religions intermarry. And everybody who does belong to a distinctive group becomes more and more assimilated. With each successive generation, we all become more similar to each other. Will we still be able to identify a majority group in society and minority groups? Maybe eventually we won't be able to, and we'll all just be one big group together. And yes, your university professor is about to refer to South Park as an example, because this reminds me of an episode of South Park in which the boys go to a water park. And like usual, the character of Cartman is being his intolerant and racist self and complaining about there being too many minorities at the water park. But one of the other kids points out to him that actually there are more visible minorities here than Caucasian people, which means the white people are the visible minority, and Cartman freaks out. And there's a quick little clip here about that. Now, this whole majority-minority distinction is important. It might seem like a minor detail, but it isn't, because whoever has the position of being the dominant ethnic or racial group in society will have more power. Not necessarily who is the largest group, but who has dominance. Whoever the dominant group is will be just that, dominant. They will be in a position of more power in society, economically, politically, socially, ideologically, and so on. And the dominant group, after the dominant group, whoever is most similar to them will be next in line, and so on. This is where ethnic stratification comes from. This causes ethnic stratification to occur, which is a ranked order of groups made up of people presumed to have certain commonalities culturally and physically, so that some are in a higher position in society and some in a lower position, a subordinate position. As part of ethnic stratification, the term minority group is a term we hear over and over and over, isn't it? In the social sciences, when we refer to a minority group, this does not mean a smaller group numerically speaking. It has nothing to do with numbers when we talk about a minority group. Instead, it means a group of people with less power who receive fewer rewards than the dominant group. Coming back to Marx, just like the proletariat being in a lower position than the bourgeoisie. So my minority group means less power, less prestige, less advantage, not necessarily less numbers. Your text specifically mentions South Africa as a very clear example of this, because for decades, apartheid was the dominant system in that country. Apartheid is a system of institutionalized racial segregation that made sure that the country was dominated economically, politically, and socially by the white minority. Not the white majority, the white minority. And they did in fact maintain power for decades, quite brutally. Caucasians were the minority, a very small minority, but they were in control. So being labeled a minority group does not refer to numbers at all in any way in this discussion. And furthermore, being part of a minority group does not necessarily mean that people can look at you and see that you are. Yes, some characteristics may be visible, hence the term visible minority, but it may also be something completely invisible, like sexual orientation or mental illness or something else. They are all minority groups because they are all considered less than compared to others based on their identity. Now, the term ethnic minority is more specific. This is an ethnic group treated unequally based on their cultural or physical differences. It is this ethnic minority status that intersects most sharply with class. I'm going to say that a second time. It is this ethnic minority status that intersects most sharply with class, which is not an opinion. It's been researched for decades and proven in every way possible. These are completely different things, but they intersect very closely, which makes sense since in every society that is not singular in ethnicity, what a person has access to or has easy access to will vary at least somewhat depending on their ethnicity. The effect of ethnicity in many ways has the exact same effect of one's socioeconomic status in regards to access. Access to education, for example, not just a basic one, a really good one. And again, this doesn't mean somebody who is a member of the dominant group, whatever that dominant group's dominancy is based on, is guaranteed to be 100% successful just because they're part of the dominant group. However, being part of the dominant group, their membership in the dominant group, is a guarantee that they will not be excluded from opportunity or resources based on that identifying criteria. In addition, all minorities are not perceived and treated the same, and their status is not unchangeable. So the status of a minority group can change. In the early 1900s, Irish Americans were very low on the ladder of ethnic stratification. Businesses would actually put out signs that say, no Irish need apply, but that has changed. Your text explains this in regard to African Americans, American Indians, Asian and Hispanic Americans. And Canada is no different when you consider which minority groups have experienced the highest degree of discrimination, such as Indigenous Canadians, and how that has also been justified, both historically and yes, currently, due to racism, which does not view race as a social construct at all. So, okay, if you have minority groups, then you must have a dominant group, or dominant groups, plural, at the top end of the ladder of ethnic stratification. Again, not based on numbers, based on who has access to the majority of power in society, politically, economically, socially, and ideologically. Remember how the dominant group dominates ideologically. We've already discussed in this course what Marx called the ruling class ideology, and we've discussed ideological hegemony. I can even refer to really, really simple examples that demonstrate dominant ideologies that we still experience in everyday life as well, to demonstrate that certain ideologies have more power than others, such as which holidays are considered national holidays, Christmas and Easter, because the people who colonized Canada had a particular religion. Other people did not, but the colonizers had more power. So does this mean that all white people are in a position that entails all of these kinds of power and advantage? No, of course not. Being Caucasian is not a guarantee of having a higher position in society. But being Caucasian is a guarantee you will not be excluded from a higher position on the basis of race. And that's very important. So a system of stratification, some kind of system of stratification, has been occurring for years, decades, centuries. And I find that in my courses, there are certain historical events that I refer to on a regular basis because of how they affected society overall, and sociology is a study of society. So things like the Great Depression, World War II, the post-World War II era, when a really strong stereotypical family norm emerged. All of these events affected the manner in which society was structured and operated. They affected people's perception and how they would think. They affected everything. And it's the same idea regarding inequality in society and all societies. A system of inequality, of stratification, has been in existence in various forms for thousands of years, affected by what does or does not occur in society, affecting all of society. This includes systems of ethnic stratification. As people moved around and encountered different kinds of people, which sounds like a really simplistic way of looking at it, but it's true. People moved around and encountered different kinds of people. You know, if hundreds of years ago everybody stayed where they were and never met anybody different from themselves, there would have been no one to stratify. There would have been no one to place in a position above or below somebody else based on ethnicity, because everybody would have been the same, ethnically speaking. I think other bases of stratification would have still emerged, but none that included ethnicity as an identifying characteristic. But that's not the way the world evolved, is it? Instead, at various points in history, people began to explore the world. There were conquests in which certain countries sent out explorers to find and colonize other parts of the world, taking control of what and who they found for the benefit of their home country. This sometimes resulted in annexation from the home country. And more recently, people have moved about the world due to voluntary immigration. You know, I think everybody has seen at some point the pictures of boats filled with hundreds of people docking near the Statue of Liberty in the late 1800s. And Canada was no different, if a little bit less picturesque. And by the way, if you weren't aware of it, those records are accessible by the public. So if you ever want to look up when your ancestors actually came to Canada, might take a little bit of time, but you can find them online, and it is really interesting. So you can find copies of and you can also find copies of the Canadian census going right back to where it began that have been scanned for people to see. Now, every time there's a war or conflict or some kind of military struggle, there is a surge of people leaving their home country and moving about in order to escape the violence, or moving about because there's nothing left in their home country for them to stay for. More recently in Europe, for example, there was a wave of Syrian refugees seeking asylum. For example, at the end of 2019, Germany reported almost 1.15 million refugees and over 300,000 people seeking asylum that year, making it the biggest host country for refugees in Europe, half of which were from Syria. And this will continue to occur unless war is somehow eliminated in some way, which is never going to happen. Hate to be a pessimist, but I think I'm a realist. Now, when this occurs, although they are refugees, and the term refugee automatically implies a problem in their home country, this is still considered voluntary immigration, even though the vast majority of those who are refugees would have ideally preferred to stay in their home country. Involuntary immigration is just that, when people are forced to leave, such as with slavery, which is something different. So our world has a very long history of people moving around our world. Historically, very few set out exploring, but that eventually led to waves of immigration in different directions. And what we've ended up with is a great deal of contact between different countries and even different people within one country.